questions. And of course, we expect that there will be questions because this is going to be very interactive. You can make use of the Q&A tab on your screen. So there you can type in any questions that you have from the conversations that go on this evening. And we'll be sure to address the questions that you may have. So feel free to type in your questions on the subject that we will be discussing this afternoon, and we'll be sure to address as many, if not all, of the questions that you will be asking. So welcome everyone to the platform breakout session. This session, we will be discussing the topic on the private sector as a catalyst for national development. So first of all, let me say congratulations to every one of you and to Nigerians. This is a very special and important day. 60 years is significant. And so congratulations to all of us Nigerians as we celebrate with the country on its 60th anniversary. And I really hope that you've been able to participate in the sessions that we've had earlier today with Pastor Poju and those distinguished Nigerians. Those sessions were really, really powerful. If you missed any of the sessions, I think you missed quite a bit. A lot has been shared in those sessions, and I'm really grateful that we had the opportunity to participate in those sessions. And we're going to take it further in this webinar this afternoon. So, private sector as a catalyst for national development. You know, it's known, and of course we all agree, that it is the business of government. Matter of fact, it is the job of government to provide for the welfare of citizens, right? And we can unbundle welfare to mean quite a number of things, from security to education to healthcare to infrastructure. We believe that's the duty of the government. Now, the question is, does the private sector have a role to play in driving national development? What is the role of the private sector in contributing, or as a matter of fact, driving the agenda for development in our nation? That's exactly what we'll be talking about this afternoon. And to help me with this discussion, I have a panel of seasoned private sector practitioners who will be doing justice to this subject this afternoon. So without much ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists who are right here with us this afternoon. First, I'd like to introduce Mr. Jide Adeola. Jide is an accomplished professional with multi-sectoral experience. He has worked in the FMCG, financial services, and oil and gas sectors. He currently serves as consultant to a number of indigenous and multinational firms. Jide is a host of PwC's annual Power Sector Roundtable and thought leader in the oil and gas industry. He's passionate about working with SMEs for growth and performance and supporting government initiatives geared at sustainable development. He's an alumnus of University of Lagos and Warwick Business School. He's also a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Nigeria. Jide is currently a partner with PricewaterhouseCoopers. Jide, you're welcome to the webinar this afternoon. We're glad to have you.
Thank you.
Next, I have Mr. Gbolahan Joshua. Gbolahan is a chartered accountant and technology enthusiast. He's a financial industry executive with over 2 decades experience covering finance, strategy, investor relations, treasury, operations, digital banking, and technology. Gbolahan has held several leadership roles in the banking industry, including CFO, CIO, COO. If you don't know what all those C's mean, we'll talk about that. And has led teams that have raised over $600 million from local and international capital markets in the last 5 years. Gbolahan is currently the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Information Officer for Fidelity Bank. He's an executive director in Fidelity Bank. Gbolahan, we're glad to have you on the platform breakout session this afternoon.
Good
And
afternoon, and happy Diamond Jubilee, Nigeria.
Thank you, sir. And last but certainly not anywhere near the least, we have Mojisola Fashola, who is the Director of Legal and Compliance at Kiramo Capital Management, and she doubles as a member of the firm's investment committee. Kiramo Capital is a multi-asset class investment firm that has been at the forefront of mobilizing commercial capital into Africa. The firm has, over the last decade, anchored and sponsored or supported about 20 private equity funds that have raised over $3 billion in Africa. Mojisola previously worked at Schwartz LLC, a New York-based private equity firm, and was formerly a senior associate at Templars Nigeria. She has extensive experience advising investment managers, banks, governments, project sponsors, institutional investors, including sovereign wealth funds, and international development finance institutions on equity and debt financing, asset acquisitions and disposals, mergers and restructurings in various sectors of the economy. Mojisola holds a Master of Law degree from Harvard Law School with a certification in business analytics and financial accounting from Harvard Business School. She's dual licensed to practice law in Nigeria and New York State, and is a chartered member of the Institute of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators, UK. Mojisola also serves on the selection committee of the Community Solutions Program, sponsored by the United States Department of State. Moji, we're glad to have you on the platform breakout session. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Oti, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Fantastic, great. So thank you, gentlemen and lady, for being a part of this. So we'll go right straight into it. And I'm going to kick off the discussion by asking a question, right? And I want to just hear your thoughts around this, right? You know, your general thoughts, and then we can begin to unbundle the different sectors. But, you know, what are your thoughts around what the role of the private sector should be in driving national development? What are your thoughts around that role? I'm going to start with Jide on this one, just to share what your thoughts are on the role of the private sector in driving national development.
Thank you very much for having me, and special thanks to the organizers of the platform. The private sector is the engine of sustainable and inclusive economic growth. And I'd like to first start by acknowledging the fact that the private sector has contributed immensely in terms of infrastructure, education, services, technology, even exports, and ultimately job creation. Private sector should not just chide government around their policies, but should think about how to collaborate, partner with government, especially in their areas of expertise, to envision, plan, and execute and deliver the agenda on national development. The private sector should drive the agenda around well-being, sustainable production and consumption, and of course the use of natural resources and the key elements of sustainable development growth goals. But for this purpose of this conversation today, there are many things one can look at, but I want to just talk about three things as priority. The first one is around the economy itself and security. The private sector creates most of the available jobs in Nigeria. It has the experience to define the viable sectors in Nigeria for economic growth. So as a catalyst, it can collaborate with government to develop policies that would enhance the opportunities in those viable sectors, especially for MSMEs. And you know, the private sector can help to domesticate inputs that can significantly reduce our import commitments. The equation I'm trying to draw here is a very simple one. Job creation stirs up economic growth, it enhances security, and of course brings stability to the country. The second thing I'd like to talk about is dealing with the issue of corruption. When you think about Nigeria, corruption, for example, based on our own studies, could erode at least 37% of our GDP by 2030 if it continues at this current pace. Because it lowers the effectiveness of government, lowers our efficiency in terms of tax spending, lowers human capital development, and makes the country unattractive to FDI, as well as how we do business. So the private sector is the critical sector that can help with reducing the impact of corruption on Nigeria. The third thing I'd like to say before I stop is around building the workforce of Nigeria. The future of Nigeria requires a different kind of workforce. And we need a workforce that meets the requirements of investors in a nutshell. So the private sector would need to work with government and sort of drive educational institutions to make outputs that are relevant for the growth of our nation. And besides that, contemplate alternative pathways in terms of vocational learning, apprenticeship schemes that that will be very useful for the development of our nation. I'll stop there so that to manage time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jide. You've kind of actually said quite a number of things there. And I'm sure we're going to get into the details of that. So before I call on Moji to pitch in on that, just again, just for the benefit of those who just joined, you don't have to use the raise hand feature. If you want to make a comment, go to the Q&A section and put in any comments or questions that you have. Thanks a lot. So over to you, Moji.
Thanks, Osi. I would say that thank you, Jide, for developing, giving such a brilliant response. And I would say that he has covered majority of it. In addition to what he has said, I should add that currently in Nigeria, the private sector is doing tremendously well, either in terms of job creation. A World Bank report puts that at about over 40% in comparison to 9% that the public sector is generating. Now, outside of that, you have the informal sector creating about 54% of jobs in Nigeria, and that's largely private sector driven. So you would see that in terms of job creation, we should look more at the private sector, and the private sector is doing very well in this regard. Now, let's go granular and let's take it down to financing. The current budget of Nigeria is 10.8 trillion naira. About 80% of that has been targeted for recurrent expenditure, with just 20% going to capital projects. Now, if you look at what's going on with COVID, reduced consumer spending, the fact that earnings of governments will be significantly impacted, despite the fact that we have VAT at 7.5%, it's very unlikely because of reduced consumer spending, government earnings will be significantly impacted. And so even your 20% that is set for capital expenditure is now significantly challenged. And so the private sector will potentially have to bridge or fill that gap in terms of health infrastructure, road infrastructure, and what have you. Now, let's also look at a lot of startups that are coming on board. Interest rates are high. There are a couple of things there are a lot of policies that are stifling, and a lot of people will tell you that it's just difficult to get loans. Private sector plays a very significant role in that aspect as well. Because of time, I'll just leave it there and allow Gbolahan to take it from there.
Thank you, Moji. Thanks a lot. Gbolahan, what are your initial thoughts around the role of the private sector in driving development?
Definitely job creation, they have to do a lot there, but then they have to do it in a regulated environment. So, the government needs to regulate the private sector, because the private sector is not driving job creation just because they want to drive job creation. They are profit-oriented, and so you need a strong regulatory framework to ensure they're doing the right thing. Now, if you look at the sectors where you've got very strong regulatory bodies, what you find out that the private sector has been able to unlock a lot of value in those places. Look at telecoms, you look at the banking sector, look at the pension assets that are now over 11 trillion. So the private sector has a role to play. They have to collaborate with the government. The private sector also has a role to play in funding government, where government has a deficit, because government doesn't have all the resources. So you need a vibrant private sector to also fund the government, for the government to be able to provide social amenities for the citizens. So I'll stop here for now.
Okay, fantastic. Just listening to you guys, obviously there's a lot that the private sector can do in the different sectors in contributing to development. So let's kind of begin to talk about these areas individually. And I like the fact that nearly all of you harped on job creation, which is really fundamental to building any economy. All right. And it speaks to poverty as well. All right. We know that from recent reports, about 40% of Nigerians are said to be grappling with extreme poverty. And you talk about job creation. We also know that at least from the second quarter of 2020 report by the NBS, unemployment rate is still about 27% in Nigeria, which is pretty high. Because what that means is that you have about 20 million plus Nigerians who are not employed. And when you add the underemployment rate to that, which is about 28%, you get to almost 55% of unemployed and underemployed Nigerians. Now, for a population that is mostly made up of youths, my question here, and again, I'm going to start off with you, Jide, on this is, how can the private sector do more in terms of opening up the space for job creation? And, you can also speak to what are some of the challenges why we're not creating the jobs. Because obviously the government provides the enabling environment, but most of the time, like, you did mention that the private sector creates a large percentage of the jobs. So why do we still have so many people unemployed or underemployed in Nigeria? And what can the private sector do in this area to create more jobs, for people to be more engaged, for our youths to be more engaged and add value to the economy?
Thank you very much. The fact that you mentioned a couple of numbers in terms of the unemployment and underemployment in Nigeria. And when you even look at some of the plans of government in terms of our economic sustainability plan, you find out that government is betting on agriculture and the real sector. So why is it that even though we're betting on agriculture and the real sector, we still don't have a lot of our people employed? Despite the fact that we have this factor endowments, we still don't have our people well employed. I think that the main thing is that we need to look at it from the standpoint of what makes, what would make the activities of the unemployed and underemployed useful in terms of economic growth. The outputs from the activities, say for example, agriculture, what needs to happen to it to be useful for the purpose of economic growth? Right? So when we think about agriculture, in fact, one of the staggering facts is the fact that a lot of the people that are below the poverty line are actually subsistence farmers. They practice agriculture. So I think what needs to happen in that area is for us to change our approach to it. The subsistence way of doing farming is not the right way to do it. Otherwise, the output from that process will not be useful for the purpose of our manufacturing sector and all of that. So we have to think about innovative ways in terms of the upstream activities that will take advantage of that. What do SMEs need, for example? Access to markets, the capital, and of course the factors. So if all those things are not at play, working together, I doubt that it will be very useful in terms of some of the plans that we have to get people out of extreme poverty. For example, where you have outgrower schemes that have anchor programs linked to it, they are more effective. They are more useful in terms of making sure that people are engaged. But when you have agricultural practice that don't have anything downstream in terms of the industry uses, then it becomes difficult for us to have people moving out of that unemployment bucket significantly. So let me just keep that thought there in terms of
I mean, I like what you said, especially when you talk about the SMEs. Looking into what's going on in that space, because honestly, I think the SMEs they play a critical role in driving economic activity. In fact, in any economy for that matter, not just in developing economies, because they really employ quite a number of people, as we know. So I guess that kind of leads me to Gbolahan on this one, and let's talk a little bit about the SMEs here, because of course not everybody's going to get into the large corporations and all of that, but one of the biggest challenges that we know SMEs face is the issue of financing. All right. And so you have SMEs. There's a report from PwC actually that stated that about 31% of SMEs say that they applied for bank loans and they never got it. All right. which is a problem because, that same report talked about that, the fact that these SMEs, their source of financing usually is maybe from family, from friends, and so on. And of course, that limits their capacity to do more and create more jobs. So my question to you, sir, being a banker, okay, is why are you guys not financing the real sector? Why are you guys not financing these SMEs? What is the challenge with throwing capital or, directing capital to finance SMEs so that it will create more activity in the economy and create jobs?
So the banker just had to answer this, yeah? Well, so if you look at the SME sector, and I'll use where I work as an example. There's a lot of financing going in there, but you have to look at some of the risks of that sector, just as a space in itself. And it's the first problem is the first thing they need is not financing. A bank will finance the cash flow. I mean, you are financing the business, expecting there to be cash flow. The first thing they need is how to set up a business properly. If you look at the business sector today, the business is much easier to run from an SME perspective. They've got Instagram, it's cheaper for them to start a business. The question is, how are they organized to get bank loans? There's BOI, there are all sorts of intervention funds. But if you look at the SME sector, what you'll find out is there are those who I call the hustlers, there are the businessmen, and then there are those who are in it just for subsistence. Each of them has a role to play. From a banking perspective, we've seen a significant increase in financing that has gone to SMEs. If you look at since the CBN started the LDR regime, I mean, the loan book of the industry has grown by almost 3-4 trillion. So you have a lot more SMEs getting access to finance. And I think what COVID has shown is finance is not the first problem. So during COVID, people have seen instances where there are loans, but you know what? Your business model cannot work just with what has happened. So I think the SMEs need to structure their businesses better. I think if your business is better structured, it increases your chances of getting finance. Number two is, what do you do with the financing you've received? I think that's where a lot of SMEs, miss it. People get money and then they mix up both their personal funds and the business funds. And a lot of SMEs mistake turnover, for profitability. So once money starts coming in, they start spending. Now, the third thing is the character, because as a business, what you are financing is that individual who runs that business. So what we've seen over time is we've seen a lot of SMEs move up from being SMEs to, bigger middle scale industry companies, but it requires a lot of dedication and discipline on the part of the owners. You're not going to go into an SME business and say, I'm in here because I'm hustling. And then tomorrow, you say, look, what are you doing? You say, I'm a distributor for this or something. Tomorrow you say, my guy, there's not one way to the market. I've diversified into another business. And then the person who's financed you on that first business, you leave what you're doing, you move to the second line of business. So what I think the SMEs need to do is structure the business, better. With BVN and the things that are being put in place in the banking industry, access to finance is going to become much easier. But the question is, what do you do with the financing you've got? What's your track record, and how do you scale for the future?
Yeah, I mean, quite a number of things you said there, that SMEs need to do, and I think those are quite instructive. It speaks to the point on having a proper structure and having a proper plan. So those are quite instructive for the SMEs there. And just still staying on this subject of financing, but I want to kind of come to Moji here, but moving towards more from an investment perspective. All right. And if we look at FDI, for example, our foreign direct investment, Nigeria is the third host country for FDIs in Africa, behind Egypt and Ethiopia. However, the World Investment Report shows that in 2019, we had FDI of $0.3 billion, which was actually a 48% decrease from the previous year. So an indication that FDI inflows into Nigeria is on the decrease. Now, my question here is, and also looking at, and we can link this also to how easy is it to do business in Nigeria? So we talk about ease of doing business in Nigeria. Well, currently Nigeria ranks 131 on the World Bank's Doing Business 2020 index, which actually is an improvement from previous year. We went up 15 places, which is good. But in your opinion, how can we attract more investment in the country? How can we drive more capital into the country and make this country more attractive for, I mean, you've done private equity and you're doing it as well, to attract capital into the country that would translate to increased economic activity?
Okay, thanks, Osi. That's a very good question. So the statistics you've mentioned, obviously, they're very correct, spot on. And so when we talk about foreign investments, let me pack it into two buckets, from the DFIs and the commercial investors. Foreign commercial investors. Now, historically, the commercial investors, they've been very generous with funding. And then recently, we've been seeing them being, quite reticent and a bit shy in terms of giving development financing to Nigeria. And that's because they believe that there are other countries that need it more. They believe that Nigeria has capacity to generate funds locally. And then even in terms of sustainability, it's becoming an issue of whether we can actually pay back in light of our increased debt service obligations. On the commercial investor side, obviously the way before now, and even till now, they are very interested in the market because of our population, over 200 million. The retail space is there for us to, for them to benefit from. But when you have challenges such as your FX, which is very, very obvious. You had a situation whereby barely 4 years ago, your FX rate was at 190 thereabouts, and it's 4 years now. It's at 385 officially, and then over significant, almost 500. And so the question is, for an investor, I'm bringing in money at 180, or let's say I even brought in money at 360 just a few months ago. And now you're telling me that there's paucity of FX in the market, and so I have to wait for some time to get my money out. I think those kind of things are likely going to impact investor interest in Nigeria. And basically what I would say is, I think we need to start looking inwards, either in terms of, Jide talked about pension funds. We have a pension, Jide and Gbolahan talked about pension funds. We have a pension fund that contributes, that is managing over $11 billion in assets. And historically, they've invested those funds in fixed income assets. We need them to start venturing into alternative investments, which the law allows them to do, but we're only seeing a very minimal percentage, maybe just about 1% in alternative investments. And these are opportunities that have the potential of creating additional jobs for the country. So I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, thanks, Moji. Yes, please.
Sorry, I just wanted to quickly jump in on the financing aspect, just to borrow something from what Gbolahan and Moji said earlier on. Because of the nature of SMEs in Nigeria and the fact that you have a huge component that are micro players, the access to capital becomes a little bit difficult because, just like you said, they cannot easily or readily approach the financial services institutions. So what we need in that area are financial agents that can mediate in terms of granting access to capital. Because imagine a micro trader that needs 100,000 naira, and he comes to any of the major banks. It's going to be a little bit difficult in terms of understanding his requirements and be able to work at that micro level across so many micro players in that sense. So that is why you have successes with things like Trader Money and all those small organizers. And then it also helps also to organize the other side. And I think that's where the private sector can also play a very big role as a catalyst to organize the micro players. So if I need 1,000 bags of wheat for my manufacturing plant, you know, it's easier for me to organize maybe 100 producers, you know, at the micro level to be able to, you know, get to that level and then organize the capital on the other side. So as a catalyst, what the private sector can actually do is to organize in that area, and then the access to capital becomes a little bit easier. Thank you.
Thank you, Jide. That is brilliant. I like this, you know, financial agents, kind of intermediaries. I think there's opportunity there. And, you know, the way you spoke about it, it means you know quite a lot about them. So as I think of starting my small business, I might just come to you to get some capital to commence my business. So that's really great. Thanks. That's fantastic. Now, I have a few more questions around education, technology, and innovation, ethics, and regulation. But I want to quickly check the chat room to see the questions some of our attendees have. And maybe we could take one or two before we get back to the questions that I have here. All right. Okay, so the first one here, which is from Christiana Babatunde, says, we have carefully seen venture capitalists fund startups in Nigeria and in the long run take over such indigenous startups. Jumia, Jobberman, NG Careers, among others, are in recent times taken over by these investors. What do you think the private sector can do to mitigate the risk of this takeover? Okay, so who wants to take this one?
Take a shot at that.
All right, Monty, thanks.
That's a very good question. And I would say that I think in terms of VC investments into startups and technology-enabled businesses, we've seen about $1 billion come into sub-Saharan Africa, and about 35 to 40% of that has been in Nigeria alone. Now, if you do a deep dive of where that money is coming from, more often than not, it's usually from foreign investors. So the first thing, right, is that we need more local VCs to begin to take an active step to begin to show a keen interest in the VC in the space. That's number one. And I say that bearing in mind, if I could just use the example of Apple, we had the Rockefeller family through Venrock, which is their venture investing arm. They took a bet on Apple way back a couple of years ago when nobody knew Apple. Today, Apple is worth over $2 trillion because somebody in the US took a bet on them. That same company also, they also supported Intel and a couple of other companies. We need a number of our HNIs, ultra high net worth investors, to start taking a bet on our startups, to invest in them. Gbolahan has said that it's so difficult for them to access debt financing. And so obviously, even the interest rates is at double digits. They ask them to bring collateral and what have you. So their fallback option is usually equity, right? Now, from a financial investor perspective, they are not running a charitable organization. A lot of startups are, you know, in terms of corporate governance, in terms of how you can actually manage and operate your business, they still have, you know, there are a couple of things that they need to do more. And so you see when someone is willing to take a bet on you and is putting in money, you see them entering into contracts and saying that, oh, if you don't deliver on your target, if you don't do this and that, we can change the CEO, we would need to acquire more shares and all of that. So capital financing is not cheap. And so if someone is taking a bet on you and is putting in equity, they try to ask for some egregious terms. And so that's where we need our HNIs, ultra high net worth individuals to begin to have a cultural shift and put more money in this business rather than leave it open for foreign investors.
Okay, thank you so much, Moji, on that. Let me take another question from our participants. This is from Adenike Oloke. Oh my goodness, I don't want to mix up this name. Adenike, your question. How can the private sector fund the government, as one of the panelists just said? So which panelist said this? How can the private sector fund the government, as one of the panelists just said?
Okay, so I think I spoke about that. So
Okay.
if you look at the government budget, when the government, cuts its budget for the year, typically you find out that the expenditure is more than the revenue. So they have to come to the market to come and fund that deficit. Now, when you buy treasury bills, you're actually funding the federal government. It's part of the deficit financing. Part of it is liquidity management, part of it is deficit financing. When they issue bonds and you buy it, when you buy all those savings bonds, those are means by which they are financing their deficit. So if you don't have a strong private sector, deep capital markets where they can get that money from, then the government will not be able to carry out some of the social infrastructure measures they've put in place. Now, I also want to speak a little bit about what Moji spoke about in terms of, VCs, funding and all that. And what you will see is, I always say, look at the fine print. A lot of Nigerian businesses, when you want to sign this agreement, you see the foreign VC companies, they have a lawyer, they have an accounting firm, they might have 4 advisors. Now you see the local company, you tell them pay for this, they'll say, no, I'm a lawyer. But no, I have an accountant. Then they sign those agreements and then the devil is in the details. Secondly, we're also seeing a scenario where a lot of people are signing those agreements under English law because they don't have a lot of trust in being able to get recourse if they get to the judicial system here. And I think that's the fallout of what happened in the Econet case. So I think local companies need to realize that when you go and raise foreign funding and those guys bring in capital, those guys have seen a lot of things. They've invested in different countries that have similarities. So they've looked 5, 10 steps ahead. And in certain instances, when they put those clauses, maybe if it was a Nigerian business, you can sit down and say, bros, this thing is very difficult. These are VCs. At times, the monies they're giving you don't even belong to them. So part of what we need to do from a local financing perspective is that we need to learn to use the correct advisors, pay for the advisors so that you are well protected, so that down the line, you don't start saying things you didn't know about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bola. Very, very key. There's no free money anywhere, right? And all this finance, there's risk elements attached to it as well. So it's not just as easy as give me money, give me money. We just need to learn how to structure ourselves and present opportunities that will meet the requirements for financing those enterprises. All right, there are lots of other questions, but let me kind of move towards education now, all right, because this is also absolutely very important in driving development. You can't even talk about development without education in any country for that matter. Now, the situation in the country today, obviously, it leaves much to be desired. That's just the truth. We know this number has been touted many times, 10 million children out of school, the highest number anywhere in the world. Now, that's concerning. And one of the reports also did say that even the ones that are in school, 27 million of the children who are in school are doing very poorly, okay? Millions of Nigeria, 30% of Nigerians are illiterate. That's about 60 million people that are illiterate. This is a problem, okay? And, we talked about earlier, I think it was Jide that mentioned at the beginning, some of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And you can't eradicate poverty if you don't have solid education system. And so my question here, and maybe I can start with you, Jide, on this, on education is, what we do know, the government has a big role to play in education. There's no question about that. But is there something the private sector can do in the educational sector to drive rapid and sustainable improvement in the quality of education and also in human capacity development? All right, because we also talk about skills, people having the right skill set. Sometimes, you interview people who are looking for jobs and you're depressed, to be honest, with the quality of people that are in front of you. So this is a problem that we have in the country. So how can the private sector play a role in helping reverse this trend and improve the education and skill sets that we have in the country today?
Thank you very much, Joseph. Very, very, very important question. I think that when we look at the ecosystem in Nigeria as something that interrelates with one another, the perspectives around how we view education will begin to change. When you realize that you're a Nigerian business, and for you to actually thrive as a business, the quality of inputs that you need to put in your business needs to be right. Otherwise, your business will have some challenges. And when we begin to look at it from that perspective, it makes us to generate more interest in the educational system. And so the role of the private sector, in this case as a catalyst, is begin to trace the steps backwards towards how they can support the various educational systems that we have, and not just in terms of providing maybe infrastructure, all of that, but in terms of even contemplating what should be taught in our educational institutions. The landscape has changed, and educational institutions should continue to consider how to adapt quickly in response to the changes in the sector, placing additional emphasis on developing skills such as critical thinking, insights, and analytical capabilities. We need to think about how to integrate new media literacy into educational programs. We need to think about how to include experiential learning, that gives more prominence to soft skills than what we have in terms of just having mental activities. There's a need to collaborate and work in groups, putting people to work together right from the educational system level, so that these outputs of the educational system is very useful to us. There is a need to broaden the learning constituency beyond even what we have here in terms of maybe teens and young adults. But I think the learning in broad ways, even outside the school system. So if we are able to do that, I think it has the potential to change the landscape in terms of what comes out of our educational systems, and then becomes more useful to us as a nation as we begin to take them as inputs into businesses in the private sector. So there must be collaboration in terms of working with government to sort of let's rethink about what we need as a nation from an educational standpoint. And I want to draw some inference from local content development in Nigeria. 15, 20 years ago, we see that what the oil and gas sector required was just skill sets, not necessarily maybe you being a graduate of chemical engineering and stuff. We need people to work on EPC contracts. We need welders. We need underwater welders. What sort of universities do you go to today that provides that kind of content? But the private sector working with this, we're able to provide vocational centers where people can easily learn some of those skills. And now we have built ourselves to a point where we have sufficient competence to be able to say that, look, as far as this sort of services required in the oil and gas sector, they must be provided locally. Why? Because we have learned it through another method, and we have developed a lot of expertise in that area, and we're able to easily replicate it across our industry. So that experience with local content, for example, shows that when the private sector collaborates with government, in this case in terms of developing policy, as well as working with local players to sort of provide institutions that will be able to facilitate the kind of knowledge or learning that is needed, then we'll be able to enhance productivity in Nigeria as a result of transforming that system. So those are my 2 cents in that area.
Thank you, Jide. Very, very, very true. The curriculum definitely needs some work. And, still just talking about education on that, and this is for you, Gbolahan, right? There were a couple of things that Jide spoke to, but I want to narrow it down to technology, which is, I don't even want to say is the way of the future. It is now, right? And we cannot afford to be behind in what's going on in the innovation space, okay? So from your, what do you think we even have a technology revolution in Nigeria, or we haven't even started that journey yet? And if we haven't, what can we do? What can the private sector do in this space? We have a very young population who I believe are talented, But some people say Lagos, for example, is the Silicon Valley of Africa. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm not seeing the output as much as I expected. But obviously, technology is playing a key role in the world today. Moji talked about Apple earlier being at $2 trillion, which is mind-boggling. It's a technology company. And we have several other examples like Facebook and Amazon and so on that are technology driven. So that's where the world is going. And so, what are we doing with the youths that we have, with young people that we have, and what can the private sector do in terms of driving innovation, creativity, and more importantly, technology revolution in Nigeria?
Okay, thank you. I think there needs to be a lot more collaboration between, the private sector and the educational institutions. If you look at a school like Unilag, and you look at schools that are positioned in commercial cities all over the world, those schools benefit from those private enterprises that are within that same jurisdiction. They work together. So you look at somewhere like Stanford, you look at Silicon Valley, you look at MIT and co, and then you look at the whole ecosystem they've created. Now in Nigeria, the universities just stand alone. They are not, there's no collaboration between them and the private sector as an innovation hotbed. That's number one. Number two is, from an educational perspective, we don't even have the funds to build the infrastructure to replicate some of the educational infrastructure. However, we can cover that up with technology. So you might not be able to build another campus that is as big as Unilag, but guess what? You can run digital and online programs such that when the guys in school are at home, the guys who are physically in the university, when they're at home, those guys running the digital programs can now come on campus. So you use that same campus, you can use it, for 4 times the number of students if you run it well. The company is doing that in Egypt today. Now, thirdly, is in terms of digital revolution, we've seen a lot from the banking sector, and then we've seen a lot of it in the financial space. So it's almost impossible today as a bank for you to have a strategy that does not include a mobile strategy, because just share transfers alone, people are doing 200 million in a month. But a lot of the innovation has been focused on the payment system. That's where we've seen a lot of innovation in the technology space. So people like Flutterwave, people like Paystack, even if you look at the airlines now, how many people go to the airports to buy tickets? They buy most of their tickets online. But a lot of the innovation is focused on one sector. I guess it's a case of follow the money. However, we need to start unlocking innovation in other sectors. So there are a couple of guys doing very interesting things in the agri sector, using technology to do a lot of things in the agri sector. Even from a financing perspective, my institution, we partnered with a fintech called Migo. There were customers we could not lend to. We did a partnership with them. They have assessed over 300,000 loans in less than 1 year. And they've disbursed over 75,000 people. And this is pure play bottom of the pyramid. Guess what? They are using the airtime spend of those people to determine their credit request. They're just analyzing them based on the airtime spend, And look at the loans people are taking, 5,000 to 80,000. There's a mass market there, but it's concentrated in certain sectors. If you look at a company like InterSwitch is an SME that came out of the banking SME fund. 2 years ago, was it 2 years ago, they sold 20% of the business to Visa for $200 million. So today they're voted, they're supposed to be one of the few unicorns from Africa, companies that are worth $1 billion. And if you look at companies like Flutterwave, Remita, so a couple of people have come in, but I think a lot more needs to be done. Now, from an educational perspective, we now need to, just like Jide said, start developing the skills of the future. There's a lot of demand for data analysts, a lot of demand for data analysts. But you see, 25 years ago, if you're interviewing for a finance function in a bank, they'll ask you, how proficient are you in Excel? Today, no one's going to ask if you can use Excel. People are looking for data analysts. So we need to prepare people for those skills. That is what countries like India have done, and then they become a business process outsourcing center, leveraging their talents. Thank you.
Thank you, Gbolahan. Thank you. Very spot on there. So for those of my friends that are Excel gurus and they like to pride in it, you've heard it now, eh? That there's more to that than just Excel, but very useful points there, helping us to look forward. And you did mention India, which would have led me to my next question, but I cannot leave that. Let me ask a question to Moji on something slightly different, and then we go and check what our participants are also asking. And I want to talk about values, okay? I want to talk about values, ethics and values. You know, one of the, I think it was Aruma today that spoke about this at the session we had earlier today, Aruma Ote. You know, as a nation, there's a general feeling that our value system has taken a hit over the years, right? There's gradual erosion in values. And we talk a lot about corruption. Malamuno Horibadu was on earlier today as well and talked a little bit about that. My question here is this, all right? When we talk about ethics, which is how do we conduct ourselves? How do we do business? Looking at the private sector, for example. And I was having this conversation with some friends the other day, and I said, look, in the private sector, almost every company has fantastic values as their company values. Integrity, compliance, leadership, teamwork, all of those things, great values, okay? And people tend to live by them within the company at least. So who is causing the problem in the country? Because if everybody abides by these fantastic values, why is it not translating to the larger society? Why do we become different people? And when we talk about corruption, I personally don't believe that it's a problem of the public sector alone. By no means is that true. Okay, it's pervasive. It's everywhere. So how can we champion a redirection, and how can we begin to drive a change in our value system to uphold those tenets, those same tenets that our organizations are known for: integrity, compliance, hard work, and all of those kind of things? How can the private sector influence the larger society to build the right ethical values that would help this country to develop? Because corruption, obviously, no matter how much we do, no matter how much investment you bring in, when there is corruption, there's not much that can be achieved. So what can the private sector do in this regard?
Thanks, Jose. So I'll start by saying that in as much as we hear a lot of negativity coming out of Nigeria around integrity, ethics, I would say that we've had some very positive news in this regard. I spoke with someone who relocated back to Nigeria, and he said that he had to do a security. He's trying to set up a company, and he had to go through some security checks with the DSS. And he said that all through the process, he didn't pay a dime. He wasn't asked for a bribe. He wasn't asked for any of these things. Now, what is causing majority of these bribery and corruption? You're trying to get something from the government and they're asking you to bring some facilitation fees, is that we've realized that majority of the civil servants are not very well paid. You see situation where a level 12, 13 officer who is supposedly a senior civil servant is earning less than 100,000, right? And such person is expected to feed their family. And so when they have opportunities like this, they try to, they just want to bend the rules. And so you see things like this happen. Now, what can the private sector do? There's a place of training, expertise, making them see that. So whilst we've had collaborations, financing collaborations, either in terms of public-private PPPs, private citizens or the private sector, basically financing, doing intervention funds for the government, for the police and all that, we need to do more in terms of training and upskilling. By upskilling, I mean that when you train and speak to government workers and even your staff, and you let them realize that little request from you, this is the potential impact it has on the image of the country. This is what it does, because when you ask for a bribe and a private company is not willing to advance that, and potentially it delays transaction timelines, it delays licenses, and what have you, it gets to foreign investors. Foreign investors claim they don't want to do business because of some of these things. So we need training for them. We need training for them to really realize. And in this regard, I understand that the federal government recently issued the National Ethics and Integrity Policy, the Office of the Secretary of the Federation. We're hoping that, I mean, it's not enough for the government to just issue policies. You also need to work with stakeholders to ensure that the implementation is also well coordinated. And in this regard, I would say that the private sector has been very, can play a key role. Now, I'll tell you something. We've noticed that a lot of times people would say that, you know, in order to change the government sector, bring in people from private sector, bring in people from private sector, and you bring them there and they are not performing optimally because you've just moved, what you've just done is you just put one individual, right? He or she is working with the same set of people. There is no reorientation. There is also, we need that reorientation as a people. But having said all of this, I would say that we still hear very positive cases come out of Nigeria. We do things, we do business I work for a foreign company, we do business in Nigeria, and there are instances where, yes, you might experience some delays, but you still get your licenses, you still get a couple of things done without paying bribe.
Okay, thanks, Moji. I heard the bell ring. I promise you it wasn't from me. I wasn't cutting you short. I was actually enjoying what you were saying. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. And Moji has said, you know, the basic background of everything, and the point she's made is very, very valid. We have all this code of ethics in our organization. So I just wanted to add a couple of things that could be more, that could be a bit more practical in terms of what people do. The private sector needs to begin to continue to transfer some of the things we do in our own organizations to our dealings with the external parties. So when you have suppliers, your vendors, the people in your ecosystem, you need to probably look at how to push them in terms of imbibing those your corporate values. So if you imagine a bank, for example, a financial institution that organizes SMEs, for example, and they're able to transfer their values in terms of how they do business, their core values, and some of these things that we learn in terms of ethics and business conduct. So some of these, you know, SMEs, for example, it becomes something that they are able to run with on the other hand. The financial systems need to be able to reduce the level of activities in terms of corrupt practices that go through the financial systems. And, you know, businesses need to understand that in their dealings, just like what you said, in many areas, their dealings with regulators, their dealings with government, they need to be able to hold their own side of the bargain in terms of, you know, not committing to anything that sort of has to do with corrupt practices. I think those are the ways in which, and then when this begins to bloom within the private sector, it becomes something that the public sector also recognizes. And like I mentioned earlier on, most of the corrupt activities is not really seated inside the public sector. It's actually mostly in the private sector, in the sense that it's the private sector that facilitates it. So we just need to, you know, see how within the private sector, most active players, I mean, the active players within the private sector themselves transfer the codes that they, you know, abide with within the organization to their dealings with external parties outside the organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jide. Fantastic. Okay, let's go to our participants and see what questions that we have. I have one here from Faith Uweso, who says, indigenous players are more in our industries as private owners, succeeding management of business units from international owners. This is advancements we all appreciate, but my concerns are big. But you didn't tell us your concerns, Faith. Okay. I didn't see a question in that, but let's have faith for your concerns to be addressed. Okay, then the next one is from Ove Honorio Bay, who says, As an investor, what sector can one invest in Nigeria that can create jobs? As an investor, what sector can one invest in Nigeria that can create jobs? Any of the panelists can take this one.
Okay, let me take a shot at this. Currently, two sectors come to mind. The MSMEs contributed about 59 million jobs in 2017, according to the MBS and SMEDAN. So obviously, there's a lot of potential to be unlocked in that sector, and MSMEs, you know, startups, basically micro and small, medium scale enterprises, and it cuts across several sectors. But there's one particular sector that comes to mind, is the infrastructure sector. And that's because currently there's an infrastructure deficit in Nigeria. I say that bearing in mind, and so earlier on I had talked about financing for development and attracting investments into Nigeria. And one thing that has worked against Nigeria in terms of FDI is infrastructure deficit. So let's break it down. You do a comparison with Kenya. A lot of it's not uncommon for you to find multinationals and companies citing their regional African offices in Nairobi. And the question is, why is that so? Some people have said that, oh, it's because Nigerians are bullish, they are assertive, they are confident also, and they would rather go to Nairobi. I don't think so. I believe that the infrastructure in Kenya and the intra-regional connectivity in terms of infrastructure, good roads, is really helping them. And that's one area. If we see investment, significant investments going into that space because of the existing deficits, that's potentially going to create jobs. There's a particular transaction I worked on, which is the Azura project. That project was for a 500 megawatt power plant, and during the construction phase alone, it provided over 500, close to 1,000 jobs, both informal and formal, right? So when there's an investment in that space, you're not just talking about the advisors alone. You're talking about the welder, the electrician, the bricklayer. So it cuts across the entire value chain. So in addition to MSMEs, I would also say that if we see good funding come to the infrastructure sector, be it power, roads, whatever, name it, that would definitely attract jobs. Thank you.
Thank you, Moji. I'm going to take this one from Ifeanyi Ekwebalu. Ifeanyi asked, despite the MPR adjustments by the central bank, why do we still not have a uniform interest rate across board by different commercial banks? So, Gbolahan, you might take this one. Despite the MPR adjustments by CBN, why do we still not have a uniform interest rate across board by different commercial banks?
So typically banks will price for risk, yeah? And so, you're pricing for the risk profile of the customer. Now, obviously, the higher grade customers, they get lower interest rates. The lower grade customers get higher interest rates. The second thing you need to know is that interest rates are also a function of the liquidity in the system and the willingness of those institutions to lend. So right now, there's a lot of liquidity in the system because of the very low yields all across the market. So you have a scenario where people have more funds, loads of people have left money in the system and thinking, what next? Some people are saying, look, it's creating a property bubble in some areas. Some people are saying some of the money is moving into the capital market. You can see how it's appreciated over the last 2 weeks or so. I think by the end of September, we're almost back to, the all share index and almost erased all the losses it made this year. But basically, it's just a function of the profile of the customers each of the banks are lending to. If you are going to have all the banks having the same interest rate, then you have to get to a scenario where in some countries you index all your interest rates to maybe the MPR rate. And so everybody is MPR plus A, MPR plus B, like in the United States. So if you say you've reduced MPR, then everybody knows that my interest rate has come down by this amount and I have more money to spend. But that's not the way it works here for now.
Yeah, all right. Thank Thanks, Gbolahan, for that answer. We have a couple other questions, but I want to respect the time here because I really want us to close at 4:40 p.m. So what we'll do is I will crave the indulgence of the panelists to respond to those questions, and we'll find a way to send the answers across to you by email for the people who asked the questions. All right, and those who are still raising their hands, please use the Q&A box if you have a question or a comment to make. Thanks a lot. So right now, what I'm going to do is to ask each of our panelists to kind of sum their thoughts up together and give us their closing remarks on this particular subject. And I'd like for them to, as much as possible, share very practical thoughts around, how do we take this forward with all the challenges that we've talked about today. But what are the actionable steps that we can take to really drive this forward as we go on this journey of national development? So I'm going to start with Moji on that very quickly on what your final thoughts are.
Thank you, MC. So I'd like to touch very quickly on the very popular Free Continental Trade Agreement, which is making headwaves, and people are saying that it's going to open up trade. I would like to say that Nigeria, we need to position ourselves very strategically. A lot of countries are doing a lot in terms of infrastructure. So for instance, I talked about Kenya. Right now, Kenya is a gateway to East Africa because they have good road connectivity. Before now, it used to take 3 days from Addis to Nairobi, but currently it will take 24 hours. So the question is, when the Continental Trade Agreement, when it's launched and it opens up, certain countries are positioning themselves. And we look at the case of Rwanda, for instance. Rwanda has partnered with Cotonou, potentially wants to use Cotonou as its hub for West Africa. And so what they've done is they've entered into an arrangement with Qatar Airways, whereby Rwanda Airways, whereby the number of airplanes would potentially increase because Qatar Airways would now fund the airline. And then in addition to that, it's easy for you to move goods across the region. I'm not sure what we're doing, and we need to look at that we need to start building infrastructure, because these are some of the things that foreign investors would look at when they're coming into certain countries. They want to see what's your connectivity with other countries around you. And so for us, we need to maximize our population, our strengths. What are we doing, even in terms of West Africa, right? And then basically that's what we need to do. I would also like to quickly talk about informal economy. There's a lot of money going on around there. We need to formalize that space and just ensure that we capture the data around it, and it forms a significant portion of our GDP. Yeah.
Thank you, Moji, for those thoughts around infrastructure, trade, and informal economy. Mr. Adeola, your final thoughts.
Thank you very much, Osi. I think in my own view, I think that for the private sector to be the catalyst that it ought to be, first thing is that we must actively engage with government practically in terms of policy formulation. It is Nigerian businesses that will create Nigerian jobs, and we must have the right fiscal framework, must have the right environment for those businesses to be able to thrive. So we must work with government. We must look at policies that will enhance the development of the private sector itself. We have a lot of viable projects in Nigeria. We can help the government to identify those and work with different frameworks to sort of help the government to actualize them. Think about public-private partnerships, build, operate, and transfer models in terms of infrastructural development, so that Nigeria as a country does not need to borrow to complete them. So where we see those viable projects, we need to do that. Finally, in terms of SMEs, I think that the critical thing for the private sector to do is to organize a lot of the SMEs to be able to give them or to grant them access to the factor endowments that is necessary to stimulate the economy. When you look at the Nigerian economy and you think about what we can do to enhance our balance of trade and all of that, if we're able to stimulate our SMEs to a point where value addition can be on a lot of the outputs that we have, we can prepare that for exports, and it can help us to manage, the deficits that we are seeing in terms of our balance of payments as a country. So we need to find ways to stimulate SMEs for value addition, not just to create things that, but things that people or industries really need, can really consume, and can help us to minimize our import dependence. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Gbolahan, final thoughts?
Yeah, so I think firstly, I think the private sector needs to work with the government to unlock these pension funds. We've got 11 trillion sitting there. When Atedo was speaking this morning, he said the government needs to de-risk those sectors. Now, the government is not going to de-risk the sectors if the private sector doesn't work with them. So we need to work with the government to de-risk those sectors so that we can channel those funds there. Today, we're saving our pension and then we're lending 70% of our pensions back to the government and complaining that the government is not providing social amenities for us. Whereas the private sector can work with that same government, de-risk those sectors, and then get those monies invested so that those monies can have a multiplier effect on the economy. Second one for me is looking at financing for SMEs. We need to start looking at it as an opportunity down the value chain. So it's not only for the banks, it's for the entire financial ecosystem. How do we unlock that opportunity? Whether it's using digital lending, whether it's using the mobile phones that people have, combining it with their BVN, how can they get loans on their mobile phones? We need to unlock it as an opportunity across the country so that we can create access to finance, looking at the peculiar needs of those SMEs. Some will never be able to get some things moving, but there's one thing all of them have. 90% of them have phones. So how do we get access to finance to them? Using those phone records, and then maybe on that we leverage the BVN. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, this is really, really great. Thank you so much for these insights that you have shared. There's so much to cover. There's so much to talk about. And I think one of the things that have come out quite strongly from this engagement is obviously there's opportunity for the private sector to partner even more with the government to deliver development to the people. There's just a lot to do here. And I kind of want to sum it up borrowing Jide's words there, that it is Nigerian businesses that will create Nigerian jobs. So this is our country, and all of us have a role to play in driving the development agenda. We didn't get the time to talk about how citizens can do this, but each and every one of us, we have a role to play in making sure that this country gets to the next level. We shouldn't just be pessimistic. We should be clear and objective, but also look at the areas where we can partner and do our part to take the country to the very next level where it should be. I want to sincerely thank our panelists for taking out the time to be with us this afternoon, and for many of those insights that you have shared with us so graciously. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. And I want to thank all the participants of this webinar for taking out the time on a day that you should probably be relaxing and enjoying the holiday to engage in this conversation. I hope you're keeping safe, and I wish you the very best. God bless you, and God bless the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Thanks a lot.